Hey, everybody, welcome to Mental Health Matters, the podcast from St. Louis Counseling. It is me, Tom Duff, the Executive Director of St. Louis Counseling and a licensed clinical social worker. So, a therapist at heart and the mind of a businessman, right? That's how I describe myself so often to others. But the reality is, remember, this podcast is to help people realize that mental health touches every aspect of society and every component of who we are. And the goal is to make mental health okay to talk around the dinner table, to talk around the water cooler in non COVID times, of course. We keep our social distancing, but we do that through education and discussion and just dialogue. And so, as always, we bring on a guest, and today is no exception. We have an amazing guest. Dr. Nora Williams from WashU, Washington University, here in St. Louis. Nora, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'm going to call you Dr. Nora. It makes me feel like I'm being advised, right? But Dr. Nora and Dr. Nora and I met. Our agency was picked by WashU Olin School of Business for this project, and it has to do with uh, Nora's class in marketing. And so when we're talking about the topic of the class, which is figuring out how we can reach, how our agency can better reach people of color with our services through marketing and through our efforts. And so she has a team of students that are working on this. But as we were talking, I realized uh, you have this degree in social psychology and you're teaching inside the marketing department. And I'm a big proponent, and I'm just social psychology really fascinates me. And so I'm like, oh, you're going to be a great guest. You're going to be a great guest in the podcast. So thank you for coming on board with us and having some good dialogue today.
Of course.
Yeah. So I guess first, maybe let's just start with social psychology. So lots of people hear of psychology, but let's maybe explain a little bit what social psychology is.
Well, social psychology, it turns out, is a pretty broad, pretty big umbrella, we'll call it. That at the heart of it, it's about how people think in social contexts, but it kind of expands to include all kinds of things where it seems like there maybe aren't even other people involved. So like a lot of studies of the self are part of social psych. But you also get a lot of group level stuff. We study topics including, I'm trying to think. I'm used
Mhm.
to now the marketing spiel because I've been in a marketing department for so long. But topics include like stereotyping, intergroup relations, relationships and love. We include things like simply, yeah, how do you assess yourself, especially relative to other people? How do you think about the world around you? So the social aspect could be simply like how do you interact with like your space, your context. That I think the best way to think about it, that I gave that big long list of things, is essentially it's how people think in context. So it's kind of in between sociology, which is all about like structure and systems, and on the other end, kind of more like clinical psych things that you do, where it's very much about the individuals. We live in that in between space of it's still about individual people, but it's really about how they think in terms of how they fit into the world.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember so I'll date myself a little bit when I was in my undergrad, and and I was in a social psychology class, and I didn't know what it was. I signed up for it. It was one of those things open, but it was during the riots after Rodney King incident occurred back in the early 90s, mid 90s, whatever that, I guess it was early 90s. And so we were in social psychology class, and it was such a great experience to get a better we were able to apply some stuff, current events going on into how it all works with groups, the anatomy of a riot, so to speak,
Mhm.
the formation of these like-minded individuals acting as one, as a group. And so back then it was just so fascinating to me. And it was, unfortunate at the time. It was an awful current event we had to go through. But even locally then, and this was in Bloomington, Illinois, at Illinois State, and it was what we were experiencing in that level, and then inside the classroom as well too. So when you talk about that in between, it's like, oh, it makes so much sense on so many levels. So from a marketing, so you're in the marketing department, right? So explain
Yep.
how what that means then from a social psychologist perspective in marketing.
So yeah, how I got there. I
Yeah, yeah.
feel like there was, yeah, quite the path. So in undergrad, actually, I really split my time in my major between social and clinical psychology and was really torn about which direction to go. And I ended up in social psych, I think, because I was interested in more universal experiences that obviously there's a lot of important work done in clinical psychology. That's why I'm here. But I was really interested in things that everybody encounters. So the things that basically everybody has to deal with, like other human beings. Like, how do you make decisions? Like, how do you figure out who you are and where you kind of live in the context of the people around you? And from there, it wasn't too much of a leap to really stick with the kinds of things that everybody has to deal with in terms of how they make purchases, how they make choices, how they consume things. And so a lot of people in social psych often, especially in my program, which really focused a lot on decision making, end up in marketing departments or management groups in business schools because in lots of ways that's what consumer behavior and consumption and marketing is how people make decisions in social contexts with the information that comes from the world around them. And so that's sort of how I made that path from undergrad
Mhm.
and into a marketing department, which is not at all where I started.
And you probably never dreamed you'd be working in the marketing department, but it makes the way you
Yep.
described it, it makes so much sense. And with um, the decision making concept as well too, and you've done some extensive work around research and as well as around just understanding that concept. And when I think about that with counseling. And then, I start thinking about it in just my daily life, all the decisions that we make. And a lot of times people come to counseling because they can't make the decision, or just the
Mm-hmm.
decision to even go to counseling is such a courageous thing for people to do as well too. And you go
Yep.
back and forth, and at certain points, we have to jump forward. But my question, so I want to spend a little time maybe talking about decision making because I think about this year. All right, everyone always says, "Oh, it's 2020," and 2020 is getting the bad. It's like, oh, everything can happen. And yes, I do
Yep.
get that, but I I try not to just downplay all of 2020. But think about on the level of mask, no mask decisions we're facing. We had an election this year. Now we have
Mm-hmm.
vaccine, no vaccine. All these
Mm-hmm.
huge, impactful decisions. Besides, which do I get, the generic brand or the name brand? So I guess it's such a broad question, right? I'm getting ready to ask, but when we think about decisions, what are the things that go into that process for us? Like, where do you start when you're looking at these aspects?
Yikes. Yeah, that is a big
Yeah,
question.
yeah, exactly. Like, where do you start?
So I try to peel off small pieces.
Great place, right? Great.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work I do specifically involves how people think and make decisions in the context of other people. So I do a lot of work on things like delegation. When do people decide they don't want to make a choice and have somebody else make it? I do a lot of work on gift giving, so how you make choices on behalf of other people. I do a lot of work on how do people kind of understand how they should talk about decisions. So an example, kind of related to what you just brought up about trying to guide people into, making healthy decisions for themselves and others.
Mhm.
Obviously, a relevant topic this year. I do work on how to talk about interventions because people obviously hear about. We're trying to encourage people to, you know, wear a mask or eat healthier or, choose renewable energy rather than,
Mhm.
non-renewable energy, that kind of thing. And how do you talk about those kinds of interventions in ways that people find appealing and want to be a part of versus that kind of turn
Mhm.
them off and make them feel, unheard or frustrated.
Mhm.
And so my approach is to, yeah, just kind of take little bits and pieces of it and focus on them. If
Mhm.
you a bigger answer to that that isn't really per se what I do specifically, but a lot of the things that the field kind of has put together into big ideas. It's a lot of trying to think about what are the social norms in place. Like that's obviously very relevant today.
Mhm.
There are things like what kinds of comparisons will people make? How do people understand what's in front of them? Because they obviously don't understand things in absolute terms a lot of the time. They understand them relative to other behaviors. And so
Mhm.
understanding when things seem like wearing a mask, obviously at first felt like a big stretch. Now we're very much adapted to it. And for a lot of us, it
Mhm.
doesn't feel like, obviously we'd rather not, but it doesn't feel as nearly as kind of self-conscious and awkward as it did at
Mhm.
first. And also understanding too that people have limited bandwidth to make decisions. And so understanding when they will have the time to carefully think through something versus when are they going to kind of go with their gut or go with the first option or stick with the status quo. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, my approach has been to kind of take little bits and pieces and try to figure them out. But the field
Mhm.
has like a few big lessons to give as well about how to talk about things like wearing a mask or washing your hands. That
Mhm.
can kind of give bigger picture lessons as well.
Well, and that's always, and that's and so much what we do in counseling as well too. Sometimes somebody comes in, they have so many different things that they want to work on, or that as the clinician you say, okay, yeah, you've there's which one of these things do we work on? And it is about taking one small piece of that. And then, one of the things you said, like, how do we present a topic or maybe a conversation or a direction we need to possibly go, and how do we take that and present it in a way that is more likely to get a positive outcome or somebody willing to explore that? Is that, to me, that would be a huge part of a beginning step with that. And then is the presentation, does that initial presentation and how you present it, is it exciting to talk about? Is it something that provides the brain to wake up and get excited talking about? Is that a big part to the decision making, in the sense, like, if you can hit that right off the bat, does that really kind of open the minds? Is that really a strong point?
Yeah, so obviously people's first impressions and first understandings of things matter a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot. And getting people to really process a message can often be the hardest part. That you can send the messages all you want,
Mm-hmm.
but if they aren't hearing them, you're not going to get very far. And so, sometimes it's very superficial. Simply making the message appealing in a basic way is the way in. Sometimes it's actually once they've heard it, what you say. But I think you're definitely right that presentation does matter,
Mm-hmm.
and that we can't just assume that people will hear the message that we're sending. You have to make sure you're sending it in a way that they're going to find interesting or appealing or worth listening to, for sure.
The great mask debate, right? And
Hmm.
I mean, do you think, like, originally, like, for just the United States, right? When we first started talking about wearing masks, it was about, you wear it to protect others. And then over time, we kind of realized, well, if we're wearing it, it's gonna create some, and we were told that as well too, by CDC or NIH, something along that level. It's like, well, wearing it for your also helps yourself as well. Do you think, if that was the message at first, and I know this is purely hypothetical, right? But do you think it would have made a
Yeah.
different impact with people? so to speak. If they knew it wasn't just for someone else, it was also for them as well too.
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously, a lot of things were not as clear as they should have been in the beginning about mass
Hmm.
messaging. So, thinking way back when, at first they were like, don't wear a mask, like,
Yeah,
because they
yeah,
were worried there weren't mask supplies. And so they were worried about people running out and hoarding masks along with toilet paper and not
uh-huh.
having any available for, the people who really needed them. And so right there, that was obviously not ideal messaging when they're about
Hmm.
to come back and say, wait, oh, so actually you should have one. Like
Yes.
that right there is going to be make it a tougher sell already, because they've already
Hmm.
planted the idea that masks aren't necessary. And then when they come back and say, actually, they are, that
Hmm.
already is going to be jarring to a lot of people. I think you're right also that sometimes you find that messaging about helping others is really appealing to people, in some ways, even more so than protecting yourself, especially when you talk about people's families and loved ones. That messaging can be super powerful because people do have a drive to help a lot of the time, but not everybody does.
Hmm.
And so I think you're probably right too that if they could have made stronger claims about whether it was helpful to you to wear it and not just other people, that might have been an extra little bit of oomph that might have gotten the message across a lot faster.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think there were a number of, unfortunate, like some were, part of what happened and they weren't
Yeah.
avoidable, and some were definitely avoidable. And I think all of it together has made it more controversial than maybe it should have been.
Now, do you have any? You mentioned toilet paper, right? Now, do you have any theories on on how that happened with the mass run on buying toilet paper? You got any theories on that?
So what I've read is actually really interesting and totally makes sense that they found that very little of the supply chain issues with toilet paper and other things was about people hoarding. Like it wasn't like a handful of people going out and just taking all of it. It was that everybody, because they'd sort of started to worry and they'd heard maybe people were hoarding, that everybody just picked up an extra pack just in case. And so it turns out the system is not built to handle everybody taking an extra pack just in case. Like everything is, designed to fit capacity. And when suddenly capacity jumps just that little bit, but across everybody, that was enough to just kind of totally mess up the entire supply chain. So
That makes sense. That makes
yeah,
sense.
because I heard that and I was like, yeah, that actually it fits because I know that I did exactly that. Like one of
Yeah,
those early trips after things were starting to get really weird, I was like, I saw it and I was like, I don't need it, but I might as well grab it.
yeah,
And turns
yeah.
out when every person has that totally rational thought, it just is enough to just blow up the entire supply chain.
Oh my gosh, yeah. The relationship of that is just amazing, and it makes total sense that because I we did the same thing too. I can't tell you how many people say, I grabbed the one or sometimes two even, but it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't like you said, the hoarding factor. So yeah,
Yeah.
right there alone, this podcast, huge success. You answered the question we've all been struggling with in 2020. So amazing.
Yeah. Like I said, it's
Um,
sometimes like obviously understanding more extreme experiences is really important, and getting people to overcome issues with thinking that could lead to things like hoarding are obviously it's important. But it turns out universals are also really meaningful and can have outsized effects when that very universal thought of like, well, just in case ends up applying to everybody all at once, and then just in case becomes actually really important.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then you think about the impact that has on, a company, so they start asking the questions, right? Okay, well, do I have the manpower? If I know there might be another spike, there might be another fear, do I have the manpower to be able to try to increase that, or do I have the machinery, or do I have the space inside my facility? So then all of those, so when you look at it from that standpoint, is how the connections and interconnected all our systems are across, either interpersonally as well as our communities and nationally in that sense.
Yeah. So yeah, the other side of that, just like you kind of said, is that these companies, because they know what typical need and capacity is, they were like, there's no point in us amping up production temporarily and then incurring all these costs that won't be necessary when things just normalize as people like, just use what they have, and then eventually everything should go back to normal. And so that's essentially why it was prolonged. It was that they're like, we don't need to increase supply because we know how much people typically use. And
Hmm.
so there's no need for us to like go into overdrive because eventually things will even out again.
Yeah, which then if you take as a regular person in the community, if I take an objective way of looking at that situation, I can't sit there and fault the company or the owner of that company or the store who doesn't have all the supply, because that makes sense to me then, which then creates less escalation. And we still may be frustrated, but maybe not to the level of, yeah, why didn't they plan for this? Well, it doesn't make
Hmm.
financial, that'll break the company. Then there won't be any toilet
Yeah.
paper, whatever the product is, in that sense. So, and I think that's the beauty of when you start peeling back all these layers, and the decisions on why a company may or may not, increase production in that sense. Um,
Yep.
and that's what comes back to for me anyway, the fascinating part of decision making. And, and on the clinical side, we have, when people come in, let me ask you this. A lot of times I think we're wired fight or flight. Like a lot of times our experiences growing up, we get wired one way or another, right? And so I used
Hmm.
to do some training with National Guard individuals and stress and how they would handle certain situations. Um, you might be wired for flight, and then you end up in the military, right? And then when you are faced with all your training, then is saying, well, you need to go fight, and then you need to run into battle instead of what your body's telling you to say, flight, 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 and it creates all this stress inside of you with that
Hmm.
decision. So when it comes to the decision making as well, like that example, like the wiring of who we are, sometimes goes against maybe what our work is telling us to do, or what our also like our decision on what's in the best interest of, when we look at everything. So how do you start navigating some of those, like when you get into that level of it, like I know taking off small chunks, but I guess maybe the question is, how much do you think that how we're wired affects decision making, and then do you see that level of stress that could occur from that when it goes against how we're wired?
Oh, for sure. It definitely, we are built to repeat behaviors for sure. Just going back to toilet paper, part of why they know exactly how much to make is that people are extremely habitual. That if you look at how much of their behavior is habitual, like it's repeated over and over again, it's almost half. That if you think about your day, how much of what you do is something that you've done before. It's a lot of it, right? You get
Mhm.
up, probably do the get ready in the same order, you use the same toothpaste, you use the same shower gel, like all of those things are going to be the same. And so there are lots of ways in which we just repeat the same behaviors over and over again without really thinking much about them. And that is important in a lot of ways. That saves us a lot of time and energy. Think about if you had to decide every single thing about your day as you encountered it, how you would not accomplish anything at all, right? You would spend
Mhm.
your day making decisions, get to the point where you're brushing your teeth and have to go to bed again. Right?
Uh-huh.
And so
Uh-huh.
that idea of us being kind of wired to repeat ourselves and to have patterns of behavior just kind of loop, is it's the way we should work. But it does mean that occasionally we can run into issues where we are repeating behaviors that are not helpful to us, because that's what we know and what we're built to do. And interrupting those circuits is very effortful. And even if we actively do so, any time that we don't have the capacity to effortfully make those changes, we go right back to what we were doing before.
Mhm.
So yeah, obviously you're talking in terms of like clinical psych and the really maladaptive patterns people can have, but it's true even of like those small scale things that we do
Hmm.
every day, can still have that same kind of like repeat things without thinking about it much. And it's really hard to make changes because, thinking effortfully is so hard and taxing on people.
Yeah, that emotional drain, mental drain, and sometimes that's more tiring than physical labor jobs as well too. And so then we avoid sometimes maybe having to make those decisions because all of a sudden I just don't want to go through. I don't want to be drained
Mm-hmm.
like that in that sense. I even think about as you're talking, I even think about sometimes the simple. If I'm in the grocery store and I'm looking at the cereal aisle, right, and I see the Fruit Loops. I always use Fruit Loops in my examples on podcasts. I think I might have a problem. I'm not for sure. But I see the Fruit Loops, right? And I see the cereal that might be a little bit more healthy. And I know I need to have that healthier cereal, right? Because I know I'm also trying to maybe lose a few pounds. But that box of Fruit Loops speaks to me a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
So I even go back to what you were saying, like it's appealing to me. Those colors and all that is a lot more appealing than the cornflakes box. So I think even that, it's like when you look at the decision makings that we go on. So in that example, so from a decision making standpoint, I mean, I'm painting that picture for you, but like, what are the things that would stand out from a cereal aisle on making decisions, and like, what are the creators of those brands wanting in that sense as well too, and then how's it speaking to us?
Um, wow. So yeah, even cereal is a complicated decision because you mentioned things like there's obviously flavor and like what it tastes like. Is it, crunchy? Is it sweet? Is it all those things? Is it good for you? Like how much sugar does it have? Is it full of whole grains? There's even things like, Fruit Loops has Toucan Sam. So there's a lot of branding involved in the appeal of branding, the decision to get like the real Fruit Loops versus the store brand Fruit Loops.
True.
There's a lot going on there, which
Mhm.
is in part why people end up getting the same thing over and over again, is because to have to make that choice anew every single time you go to the grocery store, that's a lot to ask of, this like
Mhm.
few pounds of mush up there
Yeah,
that's already
yeah.
working really hard.
Uh-huh. That's so true. Like there's even as you were talking, there was like, oh, yeah, that's true too. The generic ones at this store are better than the generic ones
Mhm.
that, yeah. So then we become the creature of habit, and then we realize don't even look. So I might not even look at those other aspects. I keep my head down walking through, and that helps me make the decision and be comfortable with that as we go.
Yeah. So companies have been trying to make changes to help make decisions a little bit easier. So you may have noticed like now at the top of the boxes, there are like a few of the nutrition facts that really stand out. So like how many grams of sugar, how many grams of fiber, that kind of thing are up at the top. So it's a lot easier to find them and make those comparisons.
Hmm.
But even so, a lot of those numbers are kind of context free. Like how much is a gram? Is 4 grams a lot? Is 8 grams a lot? Like should
Hmm.
I aim for 0 grams? Like that seems unreasonable. Like all those numbers are still kind of hard to assess without context, and so
Hmm.
they've been trying to make it easier, but it's still a real tough decision. And some people argue that really what should happen is there should just be a straight up like color on the box, like a red light, yellow light, green light system, because
Uh-huh.
that's what people need. Like asking
Yeah.
them to make calculations of like the amount of grams of sugar they have per day in the cereal versus the rest of their meals, like that's a lot to ask of a nutritionist, let alone
Uh,
just a regular person who wants something for breakfast.
why, switching gears a little bit, why do you think social psychology is important in the business program at WashU, right? Why do you think that's such a val- valuable asset to be bringing to the students as well as the department overall?
Yeah, I really think that everybody should have some training in psychology to be a business person. I think it's really vital to understand how your customers are going to think about the things that you present to them, how your coworkers are going to think about the things you present to them, how your boss will think about the things you present to them.
Hmm.
I think that's really important, and I think management and marketing are vital pieces of that puzzle of helping people understand how business works and how to make it work more effectively. I think they sometimes will get a little bit of short shrift because they feel a little like soft sciencey,
Hmm.
like the way psychology often does, where you're like, oh, you're like helping people or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think like the cold hard numbers can kind of win out in lots of business programs because they feel like the real business, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
But I think it's really important to have that perspective and understand, how do people think about, the marketing materials you send them? How do people think about the feedback you give them on their work? How do people respond best to encouragement versus, punishment? How do people, you know, assort themselves into, groups or, cliques at work? Like, all those kinds of questions are really important and are part of what makes a business work or not. And not understanding all of those basics of how people tend to think and interact means that you're going to be a little bit handicapped. You're going to have a harder time figuring out what's the best way to present this bad news to my boss. What is, how do
Hmm.
I, manage to make a name for myself and get promoted by getting people to like me? Like, having those abilities is really important, and I think it's undervalued a lot of times. And so I think marketing and management are really vital in business schools to help people get that perspective and really understand how people think and how to, get what you need out of them, either as a customer or as on the business side.
Well, and it's so, so true, So, I mean, I've only been in the nonprofit world for my career, and I've had multiple positions and stuff. And then when it comes to leadership, and then looking at the culture of your organization, the culture of your employees, and so often when we think marketing, a lot of times we think about, well, how do we market ourselves to the outside community, right? And then we want people to know about us and come to us and know our expertise. Um, but then how do we market internally as well too, and then having the ability to see, like you said, this clique or this department, this is who they are, this is how they function as a unit, these are their norms compared to the norms of that department, and then but we're one agency, and how does all those things clash? So yeah, I would totally support what you said in that sense of how valuable I think it is, for like I know you're the project we're working on is undergrads with that, and for what they're being exposed to, and even the questions they asked of us were so insightful, more than just like, well, we figure if you use these colors to market your agency, it'll be more instrumental. It was
Mhm.
about who we are, how we act, how we operate. So it's um it's such a huge tool. And I would agree too. It's undervalued or not even put into the game. I think it's better than what it was, but it's a long way to go with bringing it to the forefront. What I know it's like I get you on the podcast, I have so many questions to ask, but when you think about for people that struggle with decision making, right? And it could be a myriad of things, but even that person that's in the cereal aisle going, "Oh my gosh, I like every one of those things." Like, what are some like basic techniques, or strategies, or things to think about if you're trying to become better at decision making in the sense of maybe timelier, or easier on yourself. I know you mentioned habits, and sometimes that's easy. You don't
Mhm.
have to think about it; it's part of your habit. But if you're somebody who's kind of like thinking about like, well, I do struggle with decisions. What can I do? Like, what would be some areas you might encourage them to look at?
Yeah, so there are lots of ways decisions can be hard. And so it really depends on what part of a decision you really struggle with. For
Hmm.
instance, one thing that really resonates with lots of my students, who are obviously, super smart and high achieving and have worked really hard to get where they are. And part of how they do that is by carefully deciding things and thinking ahead.
Hmm.
They really resonate with some work I talk about on people who maximize versus satisfice. So some people are just kind of built to really aim for the best decision possible, where they, consider all of the options and weigh them all carefully against each other and really aim to make the best choice. That's great and also really hard on them. Like they anticipate regret no matter what they choose. They get very stressed about it. They're often very unhappy with their choice after it's done, have a lot of buyer's remorse. And I think a lot of them kind of resonate with that, where they're like, oh my gosh, that I definitely do that. Yikes. And so the advice often there is to think a little bit more like a satisficer, to set yourself some guidelines or standards that you want to meet with that choice. And once you find something that hits them, stop. That there, isn't anything as that really is the best choice per se in a lot of cases. That the differences are often very subjective or very small, and so sometimes something that's good enough is great. And
Mhm.
so that might be a piece of advice that you would give somebody. I think that is a pretty common. A lot of people are perfectionists or really aim for making a best decision, especially when choices are laid out and they have lots of options. And so telling them, it's okay to find a choice that's good enough. It's still good. Like, don't
Mhm.
let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think is the saying. And so that
Mhm.
fits right there. So that could be a piece of advice that I think a lot of people kind of, they hear it and they recognize themselves in it. And, it's effortful because it's hard to let go of the idea of there is a best choice and I should make it. But I think once you realize what you're doing, it makes it easier to start letting it go and just making a good enough choice in the future. Other advice that I end up giving, I do a lot of work, like I said, on self-other questions. So how do I think about myself relative to other people or in the context of other people?
Mhm.
And I recommend as one option to delegate decisions more than people do. That delegation is great in that it, in some ways, it seems to absolve you of responsibility. So when you make a choice and it doesn't go how you want, it's not your fault. And so I think that lightens people up quite a bit. So like laying out to like a server at a restaurant saying, I'm considering these two options, which one do I want? And having them pick for you is a way to get an option you were considering that you thought was appealing without the pressure of having to pick the exact right one. That you
Mhm.
get a little bit of their expertise, but you also just get the benefit of not having to choose it yourself. And so if it isn't what you wanted exactly, it's not your fault. And
Yeah.
so delegation can be, I think, an underused tool to make decisions because people are often happy to give you their advice and their opinion. And so take advantage of it and let them help you.
Mhm. That's really interesting about the because I think we've all been, at a meal of somebody and they're like, I just don't know what I want. I just don't know what I
Mhm.
want, and they're going through, and then that could be some advice I give. Let the server pick that out for
Yep,
you.
that's what yeah, it's what I do all the time now. I used
Uh,
to, yeah, just wrestle with it and like take forever and have the server like leave and come back, and it was so hard. And I realized, wait a minute, just have them pick, and then, I've already narrowed it down to things I was considering. I wanted them, and so if it's not perfect, well, the waiter picked it. It's fine. That was, of
exactly.
course, when I got to go to restaurants and eat out, which
Yeah.
hopefully I'll get to do someday again.
Way back when, way back
Way
when.
back when.
Yeah, because you haven't been in St. Louis that long, so there's probably so many restaurants you haven't been able to even visit and probably heard
Yep.
about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
mm, yeah, so and that'll be a lot of decision making there too. Which ones do I start with and go from there as
Yeah, I will
well.
say, just as a reflection of all of this, we have definitely gotten to a cycle of just a handful of restaurants for takeout, even though we know there's like a whole city full of restaurants. And I think because everything is just harder and more stressful now, it's very easy and in some ways a relief just to be like, we only have these five restaurants we choose from, and that's it. There's no having to like get new information about different places to go. So I doubt
Yeah,
I'm the only person who's kind of gotten into that kind of cycle, just because I think
yeah,
it is a little bit of a relief on decision making, to not have
yeah,
to pick from all of the restaurants in the city, just to have like the set that we have chosen as our, preferred set.
yeah, and that's another great bit of advice there too. Just kind of defining maybe what's in your bubble in that sense, and
Yep.
then this is what we'll go with one of these five instead of one of these 100.
Hmm.
And all of that, what you're describing, does so much for an individual or even a group. But if I'm thinking about an individual, it allows stress to be released. And when we talk about decision making, because I think we talk about emotional health, mental health, and mental illness, right? So everybody has mental health, but some people have a mental illness as well too. And so we all have this daily flow to mental health, up and down, and sometimes our ups, or for a while, it could go up and down during the day even. And that's normal for everyone. That's just our mental health, like we all have physical health. But
Mhm.
decision making throughout your day is so paramount in our overall mental health. Like, what am I going to cook for dinner if you don't have it already written out, right? This day
Mhm.
we'll have this day we'll have that. But if we don't have that plan, it's like, well, should I make this, or this? Then you're figuring out, okay, well, maybe the meat's going to go bad, so maybe this. But instead, if you don't
Yep.
plan it out ahead, but all that equals stress in our lives that
Mhm.
we all can live without a least amount of stress as possible. So when I saw you're kind of a guru with decision making, I was like, oh, she'll be great to have on.
Yeah, I say that this and like yeah, we joke about me search.
Uh-huh.
um, so I think a lot of the things I study are because I find decisions very stressful. I definitely maximize. I do all of these things that I should do, and part of my work has been figuring out how do I do this better. This is stressing me out. How do I make it
Mhm.
less stressful? So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
cannot promise to be the actual guru who does everything the right way, but at least I have some hints about what I should be doing uh,
yeah, yeah.
when I'm
Compared to
ideally making
me,
the best decisions.
yeah, compared to me, maybe you're a guru. Yeah, so that works. But no, I think what you brought to the table today is this enlightenment, one on social psychology, but enlightenment as well as how it fits into so many different components of our everyday worlds, but also just the concept of some practical ways of when we're facing decisions and how to make some of those. And I know we could go so deep into the decision making process with the psyche and everything of that nature. However, just some basic ways of making decisions and understanding that we don't have to be perfect, right? And there's ways we can set up systems to help us de-stress when it comes to the decision making. So you brought a lot to the table today, and maybe someday we can get coffee when we can go out in public, and I go, now tell me
Yes,
exactly what that means on this level. But
that
yeah,
would be
definitely,
great.
yeah, yeah.
Something to
But
look forward to.
excellent. See, and that we all got to look forward to something, so that's good. So, Dr. Nora Williams with WashU, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, and uh, our listeners, I think, gained some valuable insight into your world and social psychology and decision making. So, thank you very much.
Thanks again for having us. It's really fun.
Great, great. And until next time, if you're curious about our services, check us out at stlouiscounseling.org. And you got to spell out Saint, stlouiscounseling.org. Until next time, remember, mental health matters.